Dear John, good afternoon from Cyprus. It's very nice to have you on the podcast, and thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
Well, thank you very much, Christoforos. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Tell us, where are you right now in?
I'm in Bellingham, Washington, which is about as far as you can get in the United States from Cyprus if you don't include Hawaii and Alaska.
Okay. So, what are you doing currently? I read that you are a professor at the university. You are teaching.
Yeah, I'm a lecturer at the University of Washington at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. That's just a part-time job, and I'm not a tenured faculty member by any means. I really enjoy it. It gives me a chance to talk to students, young people, and also I do quite a bit of public speaking in that role around the Puget Sound area.
And recently you started writing on Substack, right? And
yes, I did. I did that because some people ask me to. You know, I don't expect to turn it into an income stream. I understand that's not easy, but I'm not even aspiring toward it. And I don't have a lot of followers, but people ask me to kind of pull my thoughts together because they thought I had some interesting things to say, and they wanted to be able to look for them in a place where they knew they would find them.
You have been in the Foreign Service for 3 decades, and of course, you have many interesting things to say, especially to people like us in smaller countries where we have relations with the US. Sometimes we depend on the US for many things. So I see from your resume that you studied anthropology, right?
Yes, that's correct. And I think that
what
was
is
really
that?
my
First
passion.
of all, explain what is that, anthropology?
No, anthropology is usually divided in the American academic system into 2 large branches. One is called archaeology, and I think everybody knows what that is. But then the other one is called, typically in the American system, cultural anthropology, or in the British system, social anthropology. So it's a form of social science. And I intended at the time that I was at the university to become a professional anthropologist. That was really what I wanted to do. But I was talked out of that in a way by my professors who thought it was a bad time to go into the field in terms of employment. So they encouraged me to join the Foreign Service, and that worked out for me. But I continue to kind of see the world through the eyes of a partially trained anthropologist. And, you know, when I was Consul General in Thessaloniki, actually I was profiled, and the title of the profile was O Anthropologos Diplomatis, which is great with me. I would like to be an Anthropologos Diplomatis.
I've read that you speak Greek, right? So you speak and read and...
I understand and read and much better than I speak now. You know, I'm one of these people who can get quite good at speaking a language, and then if I neglect it for 5 or 10 years, I really become very bad at speaking the language. I do use it, some household Greek, with my wife's family. And the reason that I originally was interested in coming to Cyprus on my assignment in the 1990s was because it came packaged with Greek language training, and I was with all these Greek-speaking people all the time. And I was always curious about what they were saying around me, and I thought, well, this is a good opportunity.
Your wife is of Greek origin?
Yeah, her parents are from Kavala. They were both from refugee families that were transferred during the transfer of population. Her father is Pontic, and her mother comes from the Sea of Marmara area.
Okay, so looking at your diplomatic career, you joined the Foreign Service in 1984, and I see that you served mostly in Europe. Initially, you were posted to Manila for 1 year, then in East Berlin during the Iron Curtain period, Indonesia. You spent a lot of time in Cyprus and Greece, and of course later in Brussels, Germany, and then in Cyprus as an ambassador. And I would like to ask you about your experience in East Berlin, Germany during that period. It was from 1985 to 1987.
Yeah.
I mean, what memories do you have? How was it? How was the situation back then?
Well, you know, it was fairly close to the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, but we didn't know that. I mean, there were hints in our environment. The whole phenomenon of Gorbachev in Moscow was very much on our radar, but the government under Erich Honecker in East Berlin was not wobbly as far as we could tell. I guess I would say that it taught me a couple of important things that I believe are very relevant now. First, I gained an appreciation for what it's like for people, the East Germans in this case, to live under a authoritarian regime. I think it's really hard for people who have never done that or been around it on a day-to-day basis to understand what it's like. The sort of normality of it on the one hand, it's not constant drama, but the ways in which life under such regimes constricts and channels you personally. So that was an important lesson, I think.
At the time, was the East Berlin considered an enemy of the US, or did you take special precautions, like when talking, when...
Oh, yes. I mean, it was completely saturated with espionage. The, you know, the Stasi, the Staatssicherheitsdienst, the East German secret police and intelligence service, they were everywhere. I mean, they knew exactly what we were doing. They came into our apartments when we weren't there. They moved things around. They very much wanted us to know that they were following us all the time. And they also followed us in West Berlin. The Stasi were very present in West Berlin. And they would give you signals from time to time that they knew where you had gone in West Berlin. So the effort was to impress upon you that you were being watched. And you know, I don't know if you've seen the very famous movie Das Leben der Anderen, The Lives of Others, but der Anderen, but it is a very accurate portrayal, I think, of the atmosphere which is created by an impressive police state. So East Germans were very aware of it. We as foreigners were very aware of it. We had escape hatches out of East Germany that they did not have, but it was a constant presence in your lives, and some people really suffered from it. I mean, even some diplomats. My wife, perhaps maybe partly because she's Greek, she had very little patience for this. It drove her crazy. She really hated it. Sometimes we would come home, for example, and they knew where you were, so they could time things well. And they would have just smoked a cigarette in your kitchen, for example.
Really?
And, they would have stubbed it out.
It's amazing.
Ashtray, and that was just what life was like.
Okay, it's very interesting. I'm currently reading the book of Angela Merkel. As you know, she grew up in East Germany. It's very interesting because she describes this before and after situation. So you were not there in the 1990s when Berlin was reunited, of course.
No, I was not.
Interesting.
And, you know, I was posted somewhere else, actually in
Indonesia
at the time that the wall came down. Actually, I was still in Washington when the wall came down. I was there for a brief time, and then went on to Indonesia, and then to the Eastern Mediterranean and so forth. But the other thing that I wanted to mention that I took from that was what a serious sort of superpower confrontation that has been kind of built into the ground looks like. That was Germany, not just Berlin. That was Germany during the time that I was there, both as a student and then later in East Berlin. And that was useful background for me when I got to Cyprus, where I lived in this divided city in a divided island. Because the character of the Cyprus division was just so different from what was going on in Germany.
In what way? In what way was it different?
It was so much more personal in Cyprus. You know, in Germany, they were Germans on both sides of the wall. Their role in the Second World War had led to the division of the country, and they were therefore a division was imposed from the outside that divided Germans from each other. In Cyprus, it was much more the product of a gradual evolution over a number of, let's say, 2 or 3 decades, which prompted ultimately the invasion and occupation of the northern third of the island by the Turkish armed forces. But people were very close to it. I mean, the people who were refugees could see their land in some cases. So they had been displaced out of their homes. This displacement element, this sort of, if you want to call it, ethnic cleansing dimension, the exchange of populations comes to mind from Greece and Turkey back in 1923. This was very different from what was happening in Germany or the center of Europe during the Cold War.
We should also say that you served in Nicosia in 1994 to 1997. It was during President Clerides' first term. So again, that was a period that Cyprus was preparing to apply and enter the EU. There were some negotiations. So forth. It was an interesting period, and then of course you came as an ambassador in 2012. Did you choose to come as ambassador to Cyprus? Do diplomats have a say in it, or?
Yes, they do, and of course, I think I never, as my career progressed, and after I had left Nicosia in that first assignment, I really never hid the fact that I would love to return to Cyprus. I'm very fond of Cyprus. And the fact is that I was trying to avoid having to work too directly on the invasion and occupation of Iraq by the United States during the period of the, let's say, 2003 to 2010. And that led me to more or less leave the Foreign Service. In all practical terms, I left. I was being kind of induced to accept an assignment in Iraq that I didn't want to take when I was leaving Berlin in 2009. And rather than do that, my wife looked on the internet and she found that a job in NATO had opened up that I had always wanted, but I thought that it was going to be occupied by a friend of mine for a very long time. And that person had to leave early, and I applied. I sent my resume in the mail, I believe. And they called me down to Naples for an interview with the commander, and it went well, and I left the Foreign Service for 3 years. But I maintained my contact with the State Department, and when the opportunity arose to come to, well, they were looking for an ambassador for the post of ambassador to Cyprus. And I was actually one of 2 candidates. The other one was extremely well connected, but Bill Burns, the man who just left the role of CIA director, who at the time was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs and then the Deputy Secretary of State, he thought it would be a good idea to have someone like me in that job because we were very optimistic about trying to restart Cyprus talks during that period. So instead of this rather well-connected and well-known person who was being promoted by Hillary Clinton, Bill Burns convinced everyone that they should hold out and wait for me, and I got the job, so I was delighted with that.
Okay. So, as I said before, I've read your article on Substack, the recent one about the title is Personal Integrity. And there you write very powerfully about the ethical dilemma of diplomats serving under Trump 2.0. as we say. So can you please elaborate a bit on your thoughts on this? What exactly is in your mind when putting this dilemma?
Yeah, I can. You know, it's important, I think, for people to realize that as you rise in the Foreign Service, you're probably less essential than you were before. You know, most of the work is done by mid-level diplomats and basically even earlier diplomats in their careers. And as you rise, your work takes on more of a political quality. I mean, it's not that you're a partisan. You're not either a Republican or a Democrat in your role as, let's say, ambassador or deputy assistant secretary of state or even assistant secretary in some cases. But you embody more of the administration. I saw Julie Fisher did an excellent podcast with you, and I have great admiration for her. I don't know her, but she seems to be extremely good at her work. And also a very likable person, I would say.
Yes, she's brilliant. And she mentioned you, I think, in the podcast at some point.
Well, that's great. I thought she did had a great conversation with you. But she said herself that the role of ambassador is personal representative of the President of the United States. And that is correct. Now, under normal circumstances, that does not create a ethical dilemma, a personal dilemma, in my view. However, this president is someone very different from our historical experience. He is, in my view, attempting to establish a different kind of regime in the United States, not just a different program of policies and so forth. He has violated the Constitution and seems not to care that the Supreme Court and other courts have ruled against him. He has ruled essentially by decree so far, with hundreds of executive orders that have been repeatedly challenged in court, sometimes vacated, sometimes declared null and void. But that does not lead to the remedy that the courts have been requesting. It instead leads to an appeal or some kind of delaying tactic, so that he is essentially ruling the United States by decree. And he is using his powers as president to intimidate basically the rest of our institutions. So he has, in ways that are unprecedented, decided to withhold funds appropriated by Congress that go to institutions with whom he has political disagreements. He has sued and continues to encourage his own Department of Justice to sue media outlets that have criticized him. He has pursued personal vendettas against people who in the past have tried to hold him to account for things that he has done. I mean, it's just an outrageous situation that we in the United States are confronting. So I think to be the personal representative of this person is not the same as being the personal representative of other presidents. And the reason that I posted that was because I was going through my Facebook feed, actually, and I came upon a post from the embassy that really annoyed me. And it was a Facebook post that the embassy had run showing a picture of a fence along the border between the United States and Mexico in the southwest of our country, and a patrol track with a vehicle on it. And it said, quoting Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, "The border has never been so secure in my lifetime." And you know, as well as I do, that foreigners are increasingly loath to visit the United States because of the perception that it is no longer safe, frankly, that you can no longer count on fair treatment at the border, that you can be somehow picked out and sent into detention. And this has happened to Germans and to others. So I just thought, maybe it's time for me to weigh in yet again. I've said this before, to say that people need to consider more carefully how they feel about devoting their energy, because this is required of you. When you work as a senior American official abroad, you should serve the government that is giving you direction. You should not obstruct it. So how do you reconcile that? Isn't that a moral dilemma? Are you doing good by serving an evil cause, just to preserve, I guess, the role that you play in that system, and also presumably maybe to somehow blunt the negative impact that it is having on the world and on Americans. I think you need to think about that a lot. I'm not directing everyone to leave. But people need to deal with this much more seriously, in my view.
I think mostly in your article you wanted to ring the bell, or raise this argument and cause some people to think about this, because one could say that being in the foreign service and being a diplomat, you have some distance from these moral dilemmas, and your job is to serve, of course, the president, but your government in general, right? So wouldn't be a huge burden to impose upon diplomats to exercise moral judgment at every stage? I mean,
yeah, I suppose it would be. However, there are a few moments like this. This is not like something that happened 5 or 10 years ago. I described there the dilemma that I confronted, and I think many people did, when the George W. Bush administration engineered basically the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq. And I mean, illegal under international law, and entirely unjustified. And but that was not on the that had nothing to do with the magnitude of the current crisis that we're confronting.
Yes,
really,
but I understand mostly you concentrate on the internal affairs of the United States.
Right.
You talk about how the situation is handled by the president inside the country, the Justice Department, and so forth. Because as far as foreign affairs are concerned, one could say that the behavior of the United States has been more or less the same over the years. For example, if you ask me, I don't see any much difference, or I could see some advantages, some benefits from the Trump administration in terms of handling the wars, in terms of the relationship with other countries, and so forth.
I mean, you may see the advantages. After all, you don't know this, but I've been a pretty strong critic of American foreign policy under the Biden administration, for example.
Yes.
So it's not as though I discovered my conscience when Trump took office. But this is far more problematic than I think you just described. Because the assault seems to be on even the pretense of respect for international law. There has been for a long time a serious disconnect between what we call the US-led rules-based international order and international law. And that has been a cause for many people to accuse the United States frequently, and often with good reason, of hypocrisy. But the current situation is one in which all sort of external sort of normative constraints and international law are entirely disregarded by this administration quite openly. Let's just consider what they've done. They have withdrawn from many international organizations and agreements. They have said basically that they don't care about international law. This has an impact on American citizens, but it also has an impact on the world. Look at what's happening in Gaza. This, by any measure, is a violation of international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict.
Or a genocide, right?
Pardon?
A lot of people say it's a genocide.
It is, and in fact, the International Court of Justice has found a plausible case to consider whether this is a case of genocide. So it's not like it's just assertions in the media or by critics. It is by jurists. So there may be a genocide underway. There certainly is the inappropriate use of collective punishment, denial of life-giving sort of needs. And this has actually grown more and more acute over the last 2 months. And there, if you look at what the Trump administration has done, it is really nothing but harm. Now, you can say that Stephen Witkoff, the sort of international negotiator for Donald Trump, another real estate developer from New York who has no experience in diplomacy or international affairs, has helped to achieve in the period before Trump took office the agreement between Hamas and Israel on a ceasefire, the three-phase ceasefire agreement.
Yes.
But Israel obtained the release of a certain number of Israeli hostages and the return of some bodies in exchange for the release of a number of Palestinian prisoners who are being held by Israel. And after that, Israel said it didn't want to proceed with the implementation of the next two phases. And the United States and Witkoff personally backed them up. So this is double dealing. I mean, by any definition, this is a lack of candor and a failure to demonstrate any objectivity and fairness in the execution of a role as mediator. And this is what you're getting with the Trump administration. We can talk a little bit more about Ukraine later, I hope. But the handling of Ukraine, the handling of the probable handling of the Iran issue is not only, I think, inept and incompetent from a professional point of view, it lacks all of the characteristics of successful mediation. And, you know, Trump may believe, and his lieutenants may believe, that you could just throw the United States weight around and intimidate people to sacrificing core interests in the context of a negotiation. But I think all of us know that does not work. And it's not going to work now. So I don't think there's much to be gained. Finally, he attacks the European Union. And to me, Cyprus' membership in the European Union, regardless of how it got there, and I'm not even going to get into that, but the fact that it's in is hugely important to Cypriots. And as things are evolving now, it'll be more important, I think, in the future, especially if the European Union takes on a greater role in defense and security matters, which seems highly likely and, from my point of view, highly desirable. So
you gave an interview to the Yale Review of International Studies in 2021, which I read, and I found very, very interesting. And among others, you say the following: I think the concept of diplomacy, the genuine concept of diplomacy, of engagement, of compromise, of negotiation, of trying to reach mutually acceptable outcomes, has lost support in the American political and foreign affairs debate. And you said that in 2021. Yes. I don't know what is your assessment now about the concept of diplomacy, but in that interview, you highlight 3 reasons about this change. And number 1 is the role of the military. And I want to discuss a little bit about that. We hear many times about the military industrial complex in the US that takes the decisions, the deep state, and so forth. So with your experience as diplomat for so many years, what is your assessment? Is there a deep state in the US? And is there a military establishment that is behind the scenes and guiding the political leadership?
I think I would disentangle those 2 questions. I don't think there's a deep state. The concept of deep state was developed by scholars to examine different kinds of regimes. There may be one in the future, but it was, I think, the clearest example of a deep state was the Kemalist establishment in Turkey. And the Kemalist establishment in Turkey was focused on the Turkish General Staff, the so-called TGS, and the judiciary. And the notion was that it was impossible for governments that were elected to sort of overcome the position, the views, the policies that had been established within this deep state, which was based on Kemalist ideology. And we saw it repeatedly over time. There were coups, there were judicial rulings that were based on Kemalist ideology, this kind of thing. So that's a deep state. That's a state that's based on the corporatist interests, I think, of 2 or 3 key elements of the establishment. We don't have that in the United States, but we do have a military-industrial complex, and this operates in the open. The deep state operates behind the scenes. The military-industrial complex operates in the open, and this is the problem with what you might call the corrupt nature of the American political system. It is openly corrupt. And in fact, I'll get into the military angle on this, but more generally speaking, a series of decisions by the Supreme Court primarily over the last, let's say, 20 years have widened the doors for what is essentially legal corruption, the legal application of money and moneyed interests in the decision-making procedures of the United States government. It's in the case of the military, it's of course true that it was Eisenhower, a man with tremendous experience with the military, who first warned Americans that this was emerging in the late 1950s.
Yes.
And the reason I think that it operates, and I think it really does, is because it serves the interests of defense contractors. Defense contractors are the most important element of the military-industrial complex. During the 1990s, they were deliberately consolidated by the US government. So we really only have about 5 major defense contractors now, and they're very powerful corporations. One of them is more or less based in my home state, Boeing. This works by the sort of, I think, molding of public opinion to perceive most international developments as security threats. So it's very closely aligned with the notion of the security establishment and the security state. And then to favor approaches to these kinds of problems that entail defense investment, buying more weapons. This is what this system essentially is about.
Yes.
And the way that it cultivates its role in the United States is by dispersing its production facilities in key legislative districts around the country. And this works. So we have seen this kind of lock on sort of massive government spending on defense sort of persist over time, except for a brief sort of dip during the 1990s when everyone was looking for a kind of peace dividend. Now, how can you obviously see that it's happening? I think the best example is the F-35, this latest generation of deployed American fighter aircraft. It's a lousy system. It is expensive. It's not reliable. It costs a massive amount of money, but it nonetheless persists. And this is one of many such programs that eat up a massive amount of money in order to serve the interests of the defense industrial establishment and their shareholders. It is not serving the public interest by any means, but it is generating massive revenue for defense contractors.
And all this, the defense companies, they subsidize the Congress, and they have this relationship, right? So it's a dependency situation.
It's a kind of symbiotic relationship, to be honest. And it's reflected in even the inquiries that and panels and so forth. All of the sort of so-called control mechanisms that Congress might try to develop are essentially staffed with people who actually come out of this same environment. So, you know, when they decide to put together a blue ribbon panel, for example, on threats confronting the United States, they choose, let's say, 6 retired 4-star generals and a bunch of former senior executives from the big defense contractors. There is very little air entering this room. It's all being sucked up by defense contractors themselves.
So this is a failure. Let's say, let's characterize it this way of the political system in the US. Another systemic failure is, I think, what we observed the last 100 days of the second term of President Trump, where he issues these executive orders, as you said before, on the basis of an emergency situation, which we don't see any emergency anywhere, and there is no resistance either from Congress or even the Supreme Court. I mean, he has his way, right?
At this point, he's had his way. People, you know, who are hoping for some relief from this implementation of a kind of different regime in the United States are always looking for signs that things have changed. But for the moment, he is having his way. And This whole issue of emergency arrangements and crises has been a problem that is waiting to happen. We strengthened beginning in the early 2000s, right after the September 11, 2001 attacks. We greatly increased the sort of authorities and reach of the security state in the United States. We did it, I think, in a moment of national panic, I suppose, but we have never actually taken measures to retract those new emergency powers that we gave to the executive.
Yes.
So in the meantime, over time, in various circumstances, other emergency provisions have been put in place which are unjustified and, in fact, are an invitation to a sort of unethical executive to exploit them at the expense of the public interest. So there is no emergency at the border with Mexico. There is no emergency with fentanyl. There is no emergency in the U.S. trade balance. None of these emergencies are valid, but these are the legal bases that Trump is using for the vast majority of his executive orders, which now amount essentially to presidential decrees until they are completely revoked. This is a trap that we set for ourselves, and it only took a nudge, really, from Trump to push us into it. The Congress, because it is dominated by the Democrat or the Republicans, and that all of these Republicans, especially in the House of Representatives, are very worried about being primaried, as we call it, about being challenged by more loyal followers of Donald Trump should they cross the president's agenda.
And lose their seat.
They would lose their seats. We have a serious problem. I don't think it's unique to the United States, but we have a lot of time servers in Congress. And I was never a fan of term limits, but I think that perhaps we're learning that without them, especially given the 2-year schedule of congressional elections, these representatives that we have in Congress really are nothing but sort of people who go out and beg for the endorsement and money from propertied interests in the United States, many of them driven by a loyalty to Donald Trump and the right-wing media ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, what is more dangerous, I think, with President Trump is that as far as the foreign policy is concerned, he doesn't even pretend to respect international law. And the most astonishing statement I heard from him the last few days is the one about Crimea and, with these negotiations about Ukraine. And he said Ukraine should forget Crimea, and that's it's over and done with it. And having in mind our own situation in Cyprus and considering that Crimea was taken by force, one wouldn't expect such a blunt statement from the President of the United States. I mean, I don't know what you think about that. How did you feel when listening to President Trump making this statement?
I mean, it's outrageous. First of all, the parties to this negotiation are, in fact, Ukraine and Russia. So our position should be, I was a critic to a degree of Biden's approach to this whole issue about no talks about Ukraine without Ukraine. I thought there was a opening for diplomacy even under those circumstances. However, the idea that Trump comes in and disposes of critical core interests of one party to the benefit of the party that is in fact at fault by any understanding of sort of national sovereignty and all the other principles of international law is outrageous. It is, you get the impression that Trump believes he kind of bestrides the globe, wielding the powers of the United States at whim in order to achieve what he regards as the greatness of the United States in the international system. This is a delusion. It's helpful to no one. It will fail, I expect. But in the meantime, he causes massive damage. And I sympathize with those who want to accelerate this failure for the Trump administration.
Yeah. As I told you, I had a podcast recently with Professor Sachs, who is very, he has a specific idea about the handling of the war in Ukraine. And I told him this argument that what about international law? I mean, you cannot do this discussion without the reference to international law. And he said that there is no international law. And he recited 5-6 situations where the US violated international law in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq, of course. And, this causes a lot of fear for small countries like ours, because if you take international law out of the discussion, then what is on the table? And
no, I totally agree with you. Okay, Jeffrey Sachs and I come from the United States. It's a big country. But do we not have the capacity for empathy to understand the views of people who come from smaller countries? I mean, how do you put together a successful foreign policy for the United States, one that actually brings benefits to not just Americans, but to our partners, if you believe that you don't even need to empathize, you don't even need to try to understand the perspective of those who come from smaller states? This is a watershed in American foreign policy. I don't think we were sufficiently alert to the views of smaller states historically.
So,
however,
John,
you can't throw them out.
I wanted to ask you about this, taking advantage of your experience. For example, when you were ambassador here in Cyprus, and you were formulating a policy, the US policy on Cyprus, and you were conveying suggestions to the US, to the State Department. I don't know how this works, but in your day-to-day considerations, was international law an element that you took into account, or was it something totally on the side?
No, of course it was something we took into account. And much of our work is substantially affected by international law. Two big issues were on the agenda when I was in Cyprus as ambassador. One was the Cyprus issue. And even though international law is not the maybe primary force engaged on the Cyprus issue, it is an important consideration. It is a particularly important consideration for the Greek Cypriot side. And it is legitimately embraced by the Greek Cypriot side. It can at times frustrate people because the provisions of international law can seem to be obstacles to what other people regard as good ideas. But nonetheless, you cannot let go of it. I mean, it is a very sound basis on which to articulate a policy about the reunification of the island of Cyprus. So that was one. And I always had a lot of respect for it, and I think it needs to be kept in mind always. The second is offshore hydrocarbon resources. The United States is in this particularly weird position where we kind of, at our discretion, invoke the Law of the Sea Convention, even though we have never ratified it. But everything that was going on in the surrounding seas around Cyprus with regard to resource exploitation was grounded in international law, and it had to be. There is no, when you let go of international law in international spaces beyond the limits of national sovereignty, you have nothing. I mean, then you're simply talking about basically resource exploitation without any kind of governing principles. And that's what we're beginning to see, I don't know if you noticed the law or the new decision, the sort of proclamation that came out of the White House authorizing deep seabed mining in the middle of the Pacific Ocean without any kind of international agreement. This is horrific. I mean, all of these areas where under international law, countries have ceded a kind of governing authority to international bodies, even though perhaps we have not reached final decisions on how we will dispose of these resources. Places that are involved are like space and Antarctica. I mean, if we begin on those kinds of issues to disregard international bodies and international law, we have nothing to fall back on. Nothing.
Yes. Exactly. I agree with you. Now, John, you served a lot of years in Europe, in Germany. You know Europe very well. And President Trump has threatened, I don't know if it's a proper word, about Greenland, which is belongs to Denmark. He threatened about annexing Greenland, taking over Greenland. And generally, if you observe what is going on in Europe, there is everybody's in dismay. We wake up every morning opening the radio, waiting to see President Trump said anything else or made any other proclamation. And what would you advise European leaders to do? How should we handle the situation? I say we, considering Cyprus as part of Europe as well, because there seems to be a situation where we don't know what to do, actually.
No, I don't think it's easy to know what to do, but my advice would be pretty simple. Forget NATO.
Forget NATO.
Forget NATO. You should retain NATO. I mean, you shouldn't kill it.
Yes.
But you should, I think, I guess you should harvest organs from NATO, you know, as to put it crudely. You should take from NATO what is useful for Europe. And then forget the security guarantee element of NATO. Forget the notion that the United States is your backstop, is your guarantor, is your nuclear umbrella. It's simply no longer true. So what does that mean that you do? You, in my view, and you know, I spent a long time working on European security policy and NATO issues. I think what you do is you take advantage of all the good work that's been done in NATO about how to develop capabilities for Europe, and then you begin to build from there. You need to create credible deterrent and defense capability in Europe, autonomous from the United States. I think this idea that was most notably voiced for many years by Emmanuel Macron is in fact correct. He was right when he declared that NATO was brain dead back in 2017 or whenever it was that he did it, and he's right about this, regardless of what you think about Macron as a politician in the French political system. So I think the work is already getting started, but it is a kind of a medium-term project to actually bear fruit. And it's not easy. It'll entail a lot of increases in the sort of competence of the European Union's organs, substantial deepening as opposed to a broadening of the European Union, new competencies in defense. But so much has been accomplished within the last 3 months that you have to have faith that it can be done. There are a lot of critics. There are some countries that are not on board.
Yes.
But that's a challenge. It should not be the end of the discussion because, you know, for a long time, my view was that Europe needed to develop its autonomous defense capability, its own defense capability. It's one of the most central functions of states is to be able to defend their own territory. But, you know, in contrast to others, most of my colleagues always said this should be done in order to complement and coordinate more effectively, to share more of the burden with the United States. That was never my idea. The idea has always been Europe needs to have this capacity because in the long run, it cannot trust the United States. And now we're seeing that this is now the truth. Europe cannot trust the United States. So it's an imperative in a way. I don't like to use the imperatives when I talk to people from foreign countries or anybody really, because really you make decisions on your own. But to my mind, this is an incredibly important task that Europe should confront together.
Yes. And everybody was totally unprepared about this because I don't know about you, but I wouldn't think before the American elections that if President Trump was elected, he would go this far with the things he did with Europe, with Canada, Zelensky, the White House incident. I mean, nobody expected this. I mean, I expected some rhetoric, you know, his usual blah, blah, blah. But now he moved many steps further and he is implementing things.
He is, and he's not stopping threats, even though the reaction is extremely negative. Look, today, the new Prime Minister of Canada, Carney, is in Washington, D.C. Carney owes his election to the vehement rejection of Canadians of this whole idea of becoming the 51st state, plus the tariffs. But mostly it's this insulting behavior, this total disregard for the sentiment of Canadians and their feeling of national pride. I mean, Trump's policy seems to be based on the notion of showing disdain and humiliating foreign partners. And of course, our allies are more vulnerable because they have learned to count on us. So it's much easier to humiliate our allies than it is to humiliate our adversaries. This, I think, I mean, you have to at some point just stop trying to understand Trump. He may indeed be insane. You look at, I mean, I encourage people all the time, if you want to try to even partially understand Trump, read through one of these long interviews that he does that lasts, let's say, 40 minutes or an hour. Just read through the entire transcript or listen to the entire tape. The man's nuts. I mean, he is an ignoramus. He is driven by sort of an intense contest with his interviewers about who's going to be dominant in the room. It's a very weird experience, and it doesn't get better. It just keeps getting worse. The man has no grasp on reality. But unfortunately, the result of this, working with his team in the White House, is to implement a wide array of highly destructive policies. I worry most about how they affect my own country because I live here. But Europe and others, Cyprus, have to be concerned about the direction of the U.S. and under Trump and the kinds of things that we're doing in the world.
You know, the joke here around the several circles is that at least till 2021, we should be hiding from Trump and his antennas so that he doesn't listen anything, hear anything about Cyprus or express an opinion of whatever sort. Even though he knows Cyprus, you know, we had a Minister of Commerce, Mr. Rolandis. It was in President Clerides'
right, and further back as well.
And he organized a beauty contest in Cyprus, and Trump was the major sponsor.
Well, Nikos Rolandis did a lot of wonderful things, but this I would not count among them.
Yes, and he said about this in an interview. As you know, he passed away, but there is an interview that I read recently. So, and he was supposed to come here, Trump, but something happened and he didn't appear. He didn't come during the contest that took place. I think it was in 1998, 99, something like that. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about our beloved island as well, John.
Okay.
So in this interview to Yale in 2021, you said the following about the Cyprus problem. You said, that's something that I think is easy to learn when you are dealing with the Cyprus problem. It's a modest advantage, modest disadvantage situation. You don't want to disrupt it so much that it becomes more dangerous for the United States. So you have to operate in a fairly narrow band. And I would like you to explain what you mean here, because I don't think I quite get it.
Well, you know, I think there was, when I came into the Cyprus problem in the 1990s, already there was this kind of, you might call it the acquis of the Cyprus issue. It had been discussed at tremendous length repeatedly, beginning, let's say, even if you want to go back to the London and Zurich Accords, but it had just been the subject of negotiation for many, many years. And this had created a kind of range in which ideas could be developed. And the sides, frankly, were comfortable with negotiating within that range. This has changed somewhat because you had, first of all, the unilateral Declaration of Independence in 1983 by Denktaş, but then you also have now a Turkish government that talks about a two-state solution as the preferred outcome. But that was not the case when I was working on the problem. So you had to operate within these kind of narrow bounds. And what you didn't want was for a situation to arise that would entail renewed violence. When I was in Cyprus for the first time, I think the public sentiment was more frightened at one point than it ever was before. It was at the time that the bicycle riders went out into the area around Famagusta and crossed into the buffer zone, and 2 of them were killed, and people were extremely frightened. I mean, friends of mine, Greek Cypriots, asked whether they should move to Athens, for example. Many of them had apartments there, or should they just leave the island? Now, it was it revived memories of 1974. And nobody deserves that. I mean, nobody should have to live with the prospect that you will return to the kind of violent history that so hurt so many Cypriots. So you never want to be aiming in that direction. You never want to run a high risk of getting back into that position. So I think you have to always be alert to the risk of breaking something that is in a way broken, but it's not as broken as it could otherwise be. So right now, one of the challenges is that you're dealing with 2 communities that live more or less separately, and more or less contently. They look at a possible Cyprus solution not as the way to, I think, mainly avoid threats, but instead is this a way to improve their lives on the island? That's a harder standard to meet. And I hope that it stays that way. I hope that it's never the feeling on the island that if we don't find a solution, our lives could be destroyed. That's not right. People should feel as though I want a solution because it'll make our lives better, and that's a limited space in which to work.
Yeah. So I want you to tell me your perspective as an American diplomat when you were serving here as ambassador on this subject. And I'm really interested genuinely to know how you thought about it. From our perspective as Greek Cypriots, we believe, and I personally believe, that the key to a solution is in the hands of Turkey. In other words, that Turkey can override the will of the Turkish Cypriots or of the administration here if it decides to move on with a solution or leave things as they are. Do you share this assessment, or do you think that things are different?
I partially at least share that assessment. I think Turkey is absolutely central, and Turkish decisions will be absolutely central to the outcome of any effort to find a solution to the Cyprus problem. But I'm going to go back, and when I was on the island in my first assignment, I spent many hours sort of sitting at the knee of Glafkos Kleridis while he was talking to my boss. At that time, the ambassador was Richard Boucher. And I learned a lot from sitting there as he sort of played with his kumbavai. And the fact of the matter is, I think he got the basic dynamic right. And that is that Greek Cypriots are afraid of Turkey, and Turkish Cypriots are afraid of Greek Cypriots. And that is, I think, something that needs to be borne in mind at every stage. The most vulnerable community in this sort of situation is the Turkish Cypriots. And they, particularly in 2004, endorsed a comprehensive settlement agreement that was very, very well designed.
You're talking about the Annan Plan, right?
The Annan Plan, yeah. And the Greek Cypriots turned it down. And then, Kans Motanawi can argue about it if you like, but the Greek Cypriots walked away. So
is this an assessment, or you have information about it?
I've talked to people who are involved, but it's mainly an assessment from the outside. But it's based on understanding what the offers were and so forth.
Yes. But again, in Transmontana, you see there the central issue, at least as President Anastasiadis recounts thing, has to do with the guarantees and the Turkish troops, and that there was no express commitment by Turkey on these 2 points. And to be honest, I read the minutes that were published, and I think President Anastasiadis is right on this point. At no stage was there an express commitment by Mevlut Çavuşoğlu on these 2 critical issues for us.
Right. I don't dispute things down to that level of detail. I think, however, the opportunity still existed based on an unprecedented oral offer that was not made at the negotiating table, but was communicated around the circle, including to the UN, that there was a very, very potentially fruitful arrangement that could have been explored much more thoroughly. And at some point, the Greek Cypriots said no. This is not unique in the history of negotiation, but that no proved to be fatal to the process. So but that, I think, has created in the international community, and I don't think this is only me, this is, I think, broadly, including in the UN and the UK and other places that follow this issue closely, that the Greek Cypriots were the party that withdrew from the process that ended in Crans-Montana. And since then, of course, talks have not been revived. But this complicates the situation of squaring, sort of putting Turkey squarely in the docket to answer for the Cyprus problem.
As you know, Turkey now promotes the 2-state solution, and for after Crans-Montana, this is their position, right? So
I think that's regrettable.
If you were ambassador here in Cyprus now, during this period, and you had from the one side Tatar talking about the 2-state solution, on the other side President Christodoulidis wanting to resume the negotiations, how would you handle the situation? What would you do?
You know, this is a little unfair to Julie Fisher, but I would say just generally,
I mean, yes. I mean, I don't want to insult Ambassador Fisher, of course, but I want to have your...
When prospects for progress are as low as they are right now, and I think by anyone's estimation, the opportunity to make progress is low. You simply would not take any risk on this set of issues as an American diplomat. There is nothing to be gained from taking risk in situations where the opportunity for benefit is extremely limited. So I would just be cautious. I would, and this has been, to be honest, the prevailing approach to the Cyprus issue most of the time for the last 60 years. When I was on Cyprus in my first assignment, there were zero talks for 3 years, none. There were 2 informal dinners between Clerides and Denktash by Gustav Faisal. That was it. That was not a less hopeful time for the Cyprus issue than today. That was a more hopeful time for the Cyprus issue than today. So the existence of talks doesn't mean very much. And the fact that you're having contacts in New York or wherever you happen to go to discuss the Cyprus issue does not mean, this is not a signal of progress. This is simply the maintenance of a kind of floor where the sides are talking to each other, and the mechanisms for taking advantage of a possible opening still exist. But I'm not sure that there's any reason to take any risk at this time, given the position of the 2 sides.
Do you think the hydrocarbons can prove a catalyst for political developments? Some people believe this.
I've never believed it. In fact, I was really out of step with my own government during the time I was ambassador, because I thought it was a mistake that we were investing so much of our hopes for progress on the Cyprus problem in hydrocarbons. The Turks were interested in it, by the way. I mean, it's not as though this was an issue that was not seen as potentially motivating in Ankara. That's not true. They did think of it. But, you know, it's in part because of the inner relationship between the Cyprus issue and international law, that this is not an easy issue to use to help resolve the Cyprus problem. Not at all. You would be, this involves, in order to satisfy the Turkish side, compromise of a kind of extreme nature with regard to international law, a body of law that is an advantage to the Greek Cypriot side. So I never thought it was going to prove very useful. And in fact, it proved to be more of an incendiary device than a fire extinguisher. So I think that it's not helpful.
John, you were ambassador when Vice President Biden at the time visited Cyprus.
Yes.
In 2014. I want you to tell me what kind of diplomacy is required for such a visit. I mean, the background, the planning. Is there like specific target from the outset that a vice president comes and we need to do this and achieve this? What was the background of this very important visit in 2014?
Well, first, it was intended from the outset to sort of demonstrate how invested we were in the process that was launched by the joint statement from February 2014, which I had a big role in brokering it.
Yes.
Because of the sort of exclusion of Alexander Downer as the special representative of the Secretary General. So anyway, that was the main intent, was to demonstrate the U.S. government's investment in this new process of negotiation. I don't want to go into it much here because it's complicated, but there was a desire as a deliverable to see the two sides agree on confidence-building measures in connection with that visit. You know, it was very difficult to broker significant confidence-building measures between Dervish Erolou, basically, and Anastasiades. Erolou was not helpful, but in that instance, nor was Anastasiades helpful. So we ended up with a really lackluster set of confidence-building measures that were brokered at a dinner that was held between Erolou and Vice President Biden and Nikos Anastasiades in the buffer zone. But
was Famagusta on the table? Because this is what is written here in the newspapers at the time, that we were expecting to hear something about Famagusta.
Yeah, I mean, was it on the table? It was under discussion. You know, this, I'd rather really not go into it, but it was probably the most disappointing thing that I ever was engaged in diplomacy. But it failed. And in the end, we were talking about really, really minor steps. By the way, this is a counterfactual, but if Mustafa Akıncı had been the leader of the Turkish Cypriot side at the time, I think there was a fair chance that it would have succeeded. But we were dealing with...
Really? You think that if Akıncı was in the leadership...
He made a huge difference. I mean, you have failed to achieve a settlement of the Cyprus issue when your opposite number is Mustafa Akıncı. It's just hard to understand. You can't do better than that. I also, by the way, Akıncı also worked with Özdilnami, and Özdilnami was a very good person to negotiate with.
So this, in a way, sorry to interrupt, puts another dimension in our discussion before about the role of Turkey. So you are saying essentially that some personalities like Akıncı or Özdilnami would, in a way, have a decisive role and could...
they could. Achieve, you know, they were plugged into Ankara, both with the foreign ministry, but also with the permanent secretary of the foreign ministry, a very, very influential person who was kind of almost, he had a wide range of responsibilities, but he was very closely following everything on Cyprus and in very close contact with his Turkish Cypriot sort of colleagues. I think if the people on the Turkish Cypriot side selling what they wanted to do to the Turkish authorities had been Mustafa Akıncı and Dervish Erol, or not Dervish Erol, Isdilnami, it would have changed things. I really think it would. But instead,
interesting.
That was not what was happening. So we didn't achieve much at all.
In the local press, it was reported that you, as ambassador of the US at the time, after the visit of Mr. Biden, you were promoting the idea of the return of Famagusta, but under Turkish administration. Is this true? Is this factually true?
That's not true. That was never an idea that I promoted. I didn't actually promote anything, to be perfectly honest. There was substantial sort of overlap between the position of the sides. This is why this sort of combination of issues had been on the table since the late 1970s, after all. I mean, this is the oldest unfulfilled desire of the two sides that there is, to somehow package Famagusta and the airport called Ercan by the Turkish. That is the oldest thing around, and there has been considerable convergence between the sides on this issue over time, but it's never achieved agreement. And this was just, in my experience, one more effort to put that together in a way that would work. It happened to occur in this case after the discussions occurred after Cyprus' accession to the European Union, which was in a way helpful to the leverage that the Greek Cypriot side had, but it proved fruitless, and that's regrettable.
A statement that created a lot of fuss here at the time was your statement about that the Cyprus problem is not a problem of invasion and occupation. You made that statement at the University of Cyprus, I think, in a forum, and it created a lot of discussions here, as you may recall. So would you like to tell me the background of this statement and tell me your opinion? What do you think is the problem? If it is not a problem of occupation and invasion and occupation, what is it? What is the problem?
Well, first, let me just say that I do believe that the invasion and occupation of the northern third of Cyprus is very central to the problem. The question was really, at the University of Cyprus, was the Cyprus problem in essence a problem of invasion and occupation? And the reason I said it was not, in my view, was because the Cyprus problem was inscribed on the international agenda in 1964. And, you know, the problem had existed, the intercommunal problem had existed on the island with the involvement of Greece, Turkey, and the UK since the 1950s. So to say that the Cyprus problem was in essence a problem of invasion and occupation, I think was misleading. The Cyprus problem was an intercommunal problem of contending nationalisms that had provoked violence at several stages in its development, and then in 1974 led to the invasion and occupation of the northern third of Cyprus by the Turkish armed forces. That, I think, is a much more honest portrayal of what happened. I've read the latest article on this that appeared in Philadelphos. And it calls upon me to go and talk to the mothers of the missing and that kind of thing. I talk to a lot of mothers of missing persons, and I am not going to be shamed by some journalist telling me that I need to talk to them. I talked to missing persons' relatives continuously during my first time on Cyprus, at a time when the position of the two sides with regard to the relatives of the missing was disdainful. I mean, they made no effort during the mid-1990s to ascertain the circumstances of the disappearance of anybody. So this was an issue that was horribly instrumentalized for political purposes during the time I was first engaged on the Cyprus issue. I care about this. Some of my best friends from my time in Cyprus are the people who worked on the missing persons issue. I care. But let's not forget that the missing Turkish Cypriots went missing in 1964, in 1965. So this is an older problem. It has a history behind the invasion and occupation of Cyprus, which cannot be ignored if you really want to achieve intercommunal reconciliation and peace.
Yeah, you see, okay, I understand your perspective, but from our view, and even if you see the Grand Montana talks that we referred them before, for the Greek Cypriots, when we say that it is a problem of invasion and occupation, beside the actual fact that it is, we also mean that if the troops leave and if Turkey leaves the island, then immediately the two communities will find a solution free from the undue influence of Turkey. And that's why we consider the security aspect to be very fundamental, because we have 40,000 troops in the northern part of the island. So it is this angle as well. Because of the invasion and the occupation, we have the troops, and if the troops leave and leave us alone, many people, and I believe it as well, we will certainly find a solution, a workable solution with the Turkish Cypriots on the basis of the situation we have here.
I mean, we will not know, I think, the answer to that question. However, and I know that many Greek Cypriots feel this way, and many Greek Cypriots of goodwill feel this way, I would say. But I will return to the wisdom of Glafkos Kleridis on this point. Turkish Cypriots fear you. I know that you think there's no reason for that, but they do. And in fact, some of the reasons that that problem exists are from that very interesting period that went from 1963 to 1974 that Greek Cypriots don't like to talk about. Of course, UNFICYP's role when it was first deployed was to protect Turkish Cypriots from Greek Cypriots. So you cannot ignore this history and expect that you will find willing partners on the Turkish Cypriot side who are prepared to, I guess, take a chance on Greek Cypriot goodwill. So that's one of the complexities of the Cyprus issue. If it were as simple as you say, I think it would have been resolved.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not saying it's simple, but
Turkish Cypriots are not, the United States probably did more than any other external party to try to cultivate mutual understanding and confidence between the two sides of this problem with communities at the grassroots level, through all sorts of work among groups that are doing work together. And that work continues, for example, in cultural heritage and all sorts of fields. But that doesn't mean that this suspicion has been overcome.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And,
totally
so
agree.
it's not, as I don't think that you can expect that the Turkish Cypriots would relinquish easily the kind of protection that they, for all the misgivings and conflicted feelings that they have about it, that they get from Turkey for some kind of international force based on the United Nations. I just don't think that that's going to happen. They had the experience of UN protection between 1963 and 1974. It was all right, but it did not, that kind of ended in 1974 with Samson and the junta and all this kind of stuff.
Yes, you are right. And one of the problems we have in both communities is that we don't feel free to say exactly how we feel.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an important issue, I think. I don't know if it's the most serious one, but it's certainly a problem. So my final set of questions has to do with your article, Personal Integrity, as you know, created a lot of arguments here because of the reference to the former president.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it was an article that you published on Substack, so you knew that everybody would read it. And I guess you suspected that someone in Cyprus would read it as well, and that it would eventually come in the public sphere. And you chose to characterize the former president as fraud and blowhard.
Mm-hmm.
And I am wondering why did you feel the need to? I mean, you could have written it, the whole thing, in a different way without this reference, right?
Yeah, I could have, or perhaps I should have, but those do reflect my personal feelings. You know, a Substack is not the sort of public record of a sort of a responsible international institution. It's just me, and those are my feelings about this individual. I don't mean any disrespect for the Republic of Cyprus or the office of the President of the Republic of Cyprus, but I had a bitter experience with Nikos Anastasiadis.
When you say a fraud, John, you mean it in the criminal sense or in the general sense that someone is not genuine, that tells you A and means B?
I mean the general sense, not the criminal sense.
So it's not trustable, you mean? It's not to be trusted, right?
Correct, yeah. That misleads. That promises things that he never intends to deliver. I think that's...
Or intentionally misleds someone.
I feel that way, but I'd rather not really parse the words. They were, you know, I think I would have achieved the objectives of the article without including them. But now that they're out there, I'm not going to retreat from them. I do feel this way about him.
Yeah. That tweet that you sent out in 2015 when President Anastasiadis visited Moscow, do you regret it now after so many years?
I don't know. It was a foolish move. It damaged my ability to do my job in Cyprus. I think in retrospect, historically, it proved maybe all right. I guess, you know, Patroklos in Cyprus Mail has called it bitchy. It was. And I guess I shouldn't have been bitchy. I was an ambassador. I was not just some guy. So it was foolish of me. Do I regret having done it? I don't know.
Is it true that because of this and because of your general relationship with the former president, you were forced to resign, or this has no foundation?
No, that's not true. Certainly pressure was applied to have me removed. I'm not going to go into the details, but it failed. And I then was uncomfortable basically working in Cyprus at that stage. And I decided to leave on schedule. But then I was so disenchanted with myself, I guess, to a degree, and with my work, and looked at different arrangements and what would make my wife and me happier. And I just decided to leave the foreign service. I was supposed to become the sort of vice dean of our diplomatic academy on the sort of ironically in the field of leadership and management. However, I did not do that. Spared a lot of upcoming diplomats that sort of experience, and just returned home and began to teach.
You also, of course, served for some months under President Christofias, if I am correct. What is your opinion of President Christofias? I mean, generally, you are general.
You know, as sort of unable, I mean, not a very capable man to occupy the office. I have more regard for Akel than most American diplomats, I would say. I dealt with their experts on the Cyprus problem quite a bit. And when I was in Cyprus for the first time, I arranged for the international visitor visit by Andreas Kyprianou, who I actually liked as a person. And when he completed, he went to the United States after I had left to go on to Athens. And I understand that when he returned from his international visitor program, he sort of lambasted the entire program as a propaganda scheme by the U.S. government, which I guess is natural for a Kel senior official or aspiring senior official to do. But I always found Kel in general to be one of the best interlocutors on Cyprus problem-related issues. And indeed, I think I'm not alone by any means in believing that one of the tragedies of efforts to resolve the Cyprus issue is the intense ideological opposition between Akel and DC, because it has really rendered far less significant the fact that these two large parties on Cyprus share a common view in many respects regarding the proper efforts to solve the Cyprus issue. And it has opened the door to Diko and others on the sort of more unrelenting, more demanding, more difficult side to thwart the efforts of the majority of Greek Cypriots in the direction of a Cyprus settlement.
Yeah. So a couple of final questions. And out of curiosity, when the U.S. ambassador meets the president or a political leader, do you then keep records and inform the State Department? How does it work, I mean, generally speaking?
When we have a meeting with a senior official, and especially the president, we do keep a record, and we do send a message back to the State Department that describes the conversation and highlights the parts that are most significant from the point of view of U.S. policy and U.S. interests. So that kind of information is typically releasable after 20 years, I believe. And in fact, much has been done with the records of discussions and other kinds of classified records that are available in the U.S. government. Before I went to Cyprus for the first time, I read a lot of these because the government was reviewing them for possible declassification. These dealt primarily with the Aitchison plan, if you recall the Aitchison plan.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And the Aitchison plan and the discussions surrounding the Aitchison plan were a fascinating topic to read about, the classified material that existed at that time on this topic before going out to work in Cyprus in the mid-1990s. It was a good reminder that very, very serious discussions on a range of options were underway long before my time. And, you saw a kind of very interesting graph, if you looked forward, of the level of interest and engagement by the U.S. government in efforts to find a solution to the Cyprus issue.
Okay. Do you think there will ever be a solution, John, honestly?
I think time is not on the side of those who want a solution, and I feel sad saying that. This may be a kind of critical time. It seems to be completely zero movement on the Cyprus issue. But the notion of separation, permanent separation with a kind of modus vivendi along the boundary between the communities has kind of taken root. It's not a solution to the Cyprus problem, but it's a kind of make-work arrangement that may meet too many people's requirements to take the action that would be needed in order to overcome it. It's ironic in a way that one of the most important steps in this entire progression was taken by Ralph Denktash, a person who really caused massive problems in efforts to reunite the island. When he opened the north to visits by Greek Cypriots, he kind of released the pressure valve in many ways. And, you know, Denktash may get his way. I hate to say it, but, you know, he was a funny man to meet with when I was there. He, the first time, he had such a bag of tricks. He was so content with the status quo. It
was his life mission to do this.
Yeah, it was. To integrate, to kind of bring Turkish Cypriots closer to Turkey.
Yeah.
And, but he also used a very funny set of tricks. I have to mention one because it...
Please do.
He was meeting with Richard Holbrooke, who for a brief time, about 1 year, was the presidential envoy for Cyprus in like 1996. And at that time, by the way, he brokered the agreement that ultimately enabled Cyprus to enter the European Union without a settlement. That was one of the things that you could say Richard Holbrooke helped to achieve. But and it was in part because he felt, and I think everyone agreed at that time, that Rauf Denktash was just an impossible, immovable obstacle. Anyway, when he had his first formal meeting with Rauf Denktash in the so-called presidential palace in North Nicosia, it was very funny because I think, you know, Holbrooke was very convinced of his own sort of historic role. He was a very puffed up man. And he goes in there and meets this sort of very, very tubby, not kind of half-kempt Turkish Cypriot leader. And I don't know if you know or recall that Rauf Denktash was an amateur photographer, quite a bad one, actually. Not a good one, but anyway, that was one of his hobbies. And he took out his camera while Richard Holbrooke was making his initial presentation of the Cyprus issue and American interest, and just continuously took pictures of Richard Holbrooke while he was doing it, as a memento, he said, of this important meeting, you know. And I think it completely wrong-footed Richard Holbrooke. He never actually recovered from that. You know, despite the fact that he stayed on for a few more months, I think after that he was immediately looking for a new job. He knew that he was never going to be able to outwit. I mean, maybe Slobodan Milosevic was not that big an obstacle, but Rauf Denktash was impossible.
Yeah. Anyway, it's all history now. John, thank you so much for your time, first of all, and your willingness to talk to me and share your experience, your thoughts. I will share your Substack article and your website on Substack when I publish this podcast. I became a follower and I read all your publications now. They are very insightful and very interesting. And it's always, in my opinion, very, very interesting to have this perspective from people that served. And you get a different idea, a different angle of how things really work in practice, because, you know, active diplomats cannot talk so much.
Right. Thank God. Christopher, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's really a pleasure to be here on screen with you. I am looking at your podcast. I really want to see the one with Jeffrey Sachs, who I quite admire for many of the things that he's done.
I will send you the link.
Pardon?
I will send you the link.
I could find it too, I'm sure. I tried to get it last night, but I saw that it wasn't going to be available for a few more hours. So anyway, best of luck. Thank you for this opportunity. You know, I do hope that the best for you and for Cyprus and all my friends back there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. Thank you.